It's 1927, and the air is thick with the weight of history as a man named Cudjo Lewis speaks of a past that seems too harrowing to believe. His voice trembles slightly as he recounts the life he led, the suffering he endured, and the survival that was thrust upon him. With each word, the unimaginable becomes real, his pain, his memories, his strength, all of it pressing against the listener like a heavy hand. He is not just a man, he is the last living link to a time many would prefer to forget. The chilling truth begins to unfold through his account, though it is not just Cudjo Lewis's individual story that captivates, it is what his life represents. He was born in 1840 in the Kingdom of Dahomey, a region now part of modern-day Benin, West Africa. His life, like that of countless others, was violently altered by forces beyond his control. In the early days of the Atlantic slave trade, his story was rewritten, not by choice but by the brutal circumstances that swept across the African continent, reshaping lives with merciless precision. His capture, a brutal rupture from everything he knew, from the languages he spoke to the very land beneath his feet, is the beginning of a narrative that transcends the personal, touching the collective trauma of millions. Cudjo was just a boy when the slave traders came. The vivid memories he shares are almost dreamlike, like fragments of a nightmare he's never fully escaped. His memories are fragmented but still rich with the kind of visceral detail only someone who lived through such horrors could provide. He speaks of the violence and fear he witnessed as his village was overrun by men who spoke an unfamiliar tongue. Armed with nothing but their greed and their guns, they rounded up the people of his village, driving them like cattle towards the shores where the slave ships waited, their dark hulls ominous against the dim horizon. The transition from the warmth of his village, with its rivers and forests, to the cold, hard deck of a slave ship could never be fully captured in words. But through Cudjo's recounting, one feels it, the crushing loss of all that was familiar. The suffocating air below deck, the stench of disease and death, the muffled screams of those who could not survive the journey. There was no place for hope here, just the grim reality of survival. And yet, amidst this despair, Cudjo's mind held on to fragments of his former life. The songs, the stories, the faces of those he loved, these things lingered like ghosts, their memories the only fuel that kept him from surrendering to the darkness. Cudjo's resilience, his refusal to forget, is what makes his story so extraordinary. While most survivors of the Middle Passage were lost to time, swallowed by the vast, impersonal history of slavery, Cudjo remained, his life a bridge between the horrors of the Atlantic slave trade and the free world that would come after. Yet, when he arrived in the United States, his struggle was far from over. The slave ship he boarded eventually made landfall in Mobile, Alabama, where Cudjo, along with hundreds of other African captives, was sold at auction. The trauma of being reduced to nothing more than property was a fate that many enslaved people would endure, but for Cudjo, it was an additional blow to his already shattered identity. No longer was he Cudjo of Dahomey. He was Chad, a new name thrust upon him by his master, a name that was not his own. He was no longer an individual with a rich culture and heritage, but a commodity, a body to be worked and used until there was nothing left. His life on the plantation was one of unimaginable hardship, but it was also one of incredible strength. Like so many enslaved people, Cudjo was pushed to the limit, physically and mentally. Yet, within him, there was a fire that refused to be extinguished. His determination to hold on to the fragments of his past was a form of resistance. It was in the songs he sang, the prayers he whispered, and the stories he shared with his fellow slaves. These were the threads that kept him tethered to the person he had once been, the person he would never fully let go of, even in the face of unspeakable brutality. Over the years, Cudjo grew into a man marked not just by the scars of slavery but by the wisdom and resilience that only a survivor could possess. His body was worn from years of hard labor, but his mind was sharp, and his spirit, though battered, was unbroken. He lived through some of the darkest chapters of American history, yet he found ways to survive. When the Civil War came, the world around Cudjo changed again, but this time, the change brought a glimmer of hope. The Emancipation Proclamation, signed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, was the moment that marked his freedom. For Cudjo, freedom was not a simple concept, nor was it a gift freely given. It was something that had been fought for, bled for, and finally achieved, but it was not the end of his struggle. Freedom, for him, was a complicated thing. It was a chance to rebuild, to try to reclaim the pieces of his life that had been torn apart, but it was also a harsh reality. The world he had known was gone, and he had no choice but to navigate a new existence in a land still scarred by the legacy of slavery. For Cudjo, the war was a painful reminder of all that had been lost. Yet, it was also a chance to start anew. Though he was no longer a slave, he was still a man without a place. In the aftermath of the war, the South was in ruins. The economic, social, and political systems that had supported slavery were in disarray. But for Cudjo and many others like him, the loss of one system meant the possibility of something else, something unimagined before. However, the reality of freedom was far from the ideal. The years after the war were ones of uncertainty. Cudjo lived in a world that was now divided, trying to carve out a space for himself in a society that did not know how to reconcile its past. And yet, despite all the odds, he persisted. His life became a testament not only to survival but to the importance of memory. He never forgot the name he was given at birth, the stories of his ancestors, the faces of those he lost. Cudjo's story, told through the lens of his own experiences, represents something far greater than one man's survival. It becomes a chronicle of an entire era, a reminder that while slavery may have been abolished, its legacy remained deeply ingrained in the fabric of America. His story, carried by his voice and through his life's journey, would resonate through time, long after the abolition of slavery. Cudjo Lewis's life and memories are the roots from which the story of America's struggle with slavery and freedom grow, each telling of a past that will never be forgotten. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition before he was torn from his homeland and thrust into a world of unimaginable cruelty. Cudjo Lewis was a boy, a son, a brother, and a member of a thriving, proud society. His early life, in the kingdom of Dahomey, was marked by deep cultural richness, a strong sense of community, and a profound connection to the land. Dahomey, now part of modern-day Benin, was a place where traditions ran deep, where warriors and artisans, farmers and healers lived side by side, each person contributing to the fabric of society in a way that was both unique and essential. For Cudjo, these were the formative years that shaped his sense of self and his understanding of the world. The village he grew up in was a world apart from the horrors that would soon invade it. His family's life, centered around agriculture and craftsmanship, was stable and rooted in long-standing traditions. His father, a respected elder, taught him the ways of the land, how to grow crops, how to read the seasons, and how to live in harmony with nature. His mother, equally revered, passed on the knowledge of their people, telling him stories of their ancestors and instilling in him a sense of pride in his heritage. These stories, passed down through generations, were not just fables, they were the very foundation of his identity. They connected him to a legacy that spanned centuries, tying him to a past that would one day seem almost too distant to touch. As a young boy, Cudjo could not have known that this idyllic life, with its peaceful rhythms and close-knit community, would be shattered in an instant. The transatlantic slave trade was already a dark shadow cast across the continent, but for many in his village, its reality was still distant, its implications not yet fully realized. The greed of European traders, combined with the increasing involvement of African collaborators, had already begun to fuel the horrific machine that would strip millions of Africans of their freedom and lives. Cudjo's village, though somewhat isolated from the major slave routes, was not immune to the violence and chaos that came with the trade. One fateful day, as Cudjo played with friends or worked alongside his father, that distant shadow became an unavoidable reality. The traders arrived, as they had done in countless other villages across the continent, with promises of wealth and power that belied the true nature of their intentions. They came with guns, with chains, with a ruthlessness that saw no humanity in the people they captured. They did not view these people as individuals with families, with dreams, with histories. They saw them only as commodities, as property, to be bought and sold like cattle. The attack on Cudjo's village was swift and brutal. Armed men stormed in, rounding up the villagers, including women and children, and forcing them into captivity. The violence was unimaginable. Cudjo's memories of that day were marked by chaos, the cries of his mother, the desperate shouts of his father, the pounding of feet as families were torn apart. For Cudjo, it was the beginning of an ordeal that would strip him of everything he had known. His childhood, his family, his connection to the earth, all of it was ripped away in the blink of an eye. His capture was not the act of a singular man or group but a part of the broader machinery of enslavement that had spread across Africa, a force that was steadily eating away at the very fabric of African life. As Cudjo was forced into captivity, his thoughts must have been a whirlwind. How could this have happened? Why were the people of his village, his family, treated with such cruelty? The concept of slavery was not new to Africa, where various forms of servitude had existed for centuries, but the scale and brutality of the transatlantic slave trade were unprecedented. The notion of being captured, branded, and transported across an ocean to an unknown land must have been incomprehensible to Cudjo, whose understanding of the world had been rooted in the familiar, his village, his people, his history. In the span of just a few days, all of that was lost. The journey to the coast was harrowing. The captured people were forced to march for days, sometimes weeks, under harsh conditions, with little food or water. Many fell behind, their bodies unable to withstand the brutal pace set by the slavers. Those who could not keep up were left behind, their fates sealed. Cudjo's memories of this journey, though blurred by time, likely carried with them the sounds of cries for mercy, the silence of those who had died, and the constant sense of fear that permeated the air. For a boy who had once been free, the journey to the coast was the beginning of a nightmare that would last for years, if not a lifetime. Once they arrived at the slave ships, the reality of what lay ahead became even clearer. The Middle Passage, that infamous part of the transatlantic slave trade, was a journey from which few would return unchanged. The ships, their holds packed with hundreds of captives, were floating prisons, designed to minimize the loss of profit and maximize the number of people who could be crammed into each vessel. The conditions were indescribable, unimaginable to anyone who has not experienced them firsthand. The air was thick with the stench of human sweat, filth, and the sickness that spread like wildfire among the enslaved. Disease, such as dysentery and smallpox, decimated the captives, while the crew of the ship cared little for the suffering, their focus solely on reaching the Americas and completing their human cargo. Cudjo's memories of the Middle Passage are likely as fragmented as they are traumatic. The journey took weeks, sometimes months, depending on the route and the conditions. The vast ocean, once a symbol of potential, became an inescapable prison. Each day blurred into the next. Those who survived the voyage did so by sheer will, clinging to the hope, however faint, that they would one day see land again. And yet, even as the days passed, something inside Cudjo must have died. The boy who had once known the soil of his homeland, the rhythms of his village, was now nothing more than a piece of cargo, a body to be transported across the ocean to be sold at auction. When the ship finally reached the shores of America, Cudjo was a different person. The boy who had once had dreams, hopes, and a future now found himself in a strange land, sold into slavery like countless others before him. His first moments on American soil were ones of confusion and fear. What would happen to him now? Where was his family? Was there any chance of ever returning home? These questions must have lingered in his mind as he was led away to be sold at auction, just as hundreds of other Africans had been before him. The experience of being sold was perhaps the most dehumanizing of all. Cudjo was no longer a person with a name, a past, or a future, he was an object, a commodity to be traded. His worth was determined by the highest bidder, his body an instrument of labor, his soul imprisoned by the very system that had torn him from his homeland. The memory of the auction block, where he was inspected, prodded, and valued like livestock, is one that likely haunted him for the rest of his life. For the first time, he understood the full extent of what it meant to be a slave in America. There was no hope, no dignity, only the brutal reality of being stripped of everything that made him human. Cudjo's story, however, was not one of complete hopelessness. Amidst the brutality and the oppression, there was something else. His life, though marked by suffering, was also a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Even in the face of unimaginable odds, Cudjo found ways to hold on to the pieces of his identity, to resist the system that sought to erase him. His survival, his determination to live, was not just an act of physical endurance but a refusal to let go of the essence of who he was, a man, a son, a brother, and a member of a people whose history and culture could never be fully destroyed. In the years that followed, Cudjo Lewis would carry the weight of his past with him, but he would also find ways to rebuild, to carve out a new life in a land that had never truly been his. His story, one of survival and resilience, would be a reminder not only of the horrors of slavery but of the indomitable strength of the human spirit. And while his journey was shaped by pain, it was also shaped by hope, hope that, even in the face of the darkest history, there could be a future, a legacy that would endure. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition. The journey across the Atlantic, for those like Cudjo Lewis, was not simply a physical voyage but a dislocation of the spirit. The Middle Passage, the notorious route by which millions of Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas, was an odyssey of unimaginable suffering. It was not just the horror of the cramped, stinking holds of the slave ships that crushed the captives, but the deeper psychological toll of being severed from everything familiar. For Cudjo, as for all others on that fateful journey, the sea represented not just a vast expanse of water but a dividing line between two worlds, two realities. When Cudjo's ship set sail from the African coast, he was still very much a boy, though the violence and terror that had already shaped his life left him prematurely aged, hardened by the harshness of what he had witnessed and endured. The days that followed were a blur of inescapable misery, a never-ending descent into the depths of despair. The captives were crammed below decks, their bodies wedged together in tight, unsanitary quarters, their movements restricted to a nightmarish crawl. With little room to move, no air to breathe, and only the most basic provisions, it is a wonder that any survived the journey at all. The ship, like all those involved in the transatlantic trade, was a floating prison, its holds designed to maximize the number of slaves it could carry, with no thought given to the humanity of those trapped within. Disease spread rapidly, and the crew, there only to ensure the cargo arrived alive, if only just, did little to tend to the captives' needs. Those who could not survive the brutal conditions, the crushing heat, and the contagious diseases were cast overboard, their bodies disappearing into the endless ocean. For the survivors, every day was a test of endurance, a battle against the forces of nature and the sickening reality of their circumstances. Cudjo's memories of the ship are fragmented, like a shattered mirror, reflecting pieces of the nightmare he lived through. He remembers the suffocating heat, the stench of human waste, the sound of chains rattling as people moved, the quiet sobs of the women and children. He recalls the endless days, indistinguishable from each other, broken only by the rising and setting of the sun. The days blurred into a sickening monotony, filled with hunger, thirst, and terror. Time had no meaning. What mattered was survival, simply staying alive to see another day. It was in these dark, oppressive moments that Cudjo, like many others, was forced to confront the brutal truth of his situation. He was no longer a boy from Dahomey with hopes and dreams, he was a piece of property, a cargo, bound for a distant land that he could not imagine. The notion of freedom seemed like a distant, fading memory. The reality of being chained, stripped of dignity, and subjected to the whims of the slave traders was a fate he could neither escape nor understand. In these moments, he may have found solace only in the memories of his homeland, his family, his village, the sounds of his people speaking their language, singing their songs, and the feel of the earth beneath his feet. Yet, even as he clung to those memories, a deeper fear began to take root, the fear that once he arrived in America, those memories would become even more distant, even more elusive, until they too faded into nothingness. For weeks, Cudjo and the other captives were tossed about on the unforgiving sea, their bodies becoming sick and weak, their minds numb to the horrors around them. The vastness of the ocean seemed to mock their suffering, a cold, indifferent force that separated them from everything they knew. Even the stars, once a source of guidance and hope for travelers, now seemed distant and unreachable, a reminder of all that had been lost. In these moments, Cudjo must have wondered if he would ever see land again, or if this endless voyage was simply a prelude to death. Then, at long last, the horizon began to change. The familiar blue of the ocean began to darken, replaced by a strange, foreign greenish hue. The ship, battered by the endless waves, creaked and groaned as it slowly approached the shores of the New World. Land that had been both a place of hope and terror, finally came into view. But for Cudjo and the others, land meant something very different from what it might have for any other person. It was not a place of safety, of opportunity, but a place where their suffering would continue, where they would be sold into slavery, their identities erased and replaced by whatever name their new masters chose to give them. As the ship neared the shore, the captives were dragged from the filthy holds of the ship, herded out like cattle, their bodies weak from the long journey, their minds shattered by the trauma they had endured. The reality of what lay ahead hit them with the force of a physical blow. They were no longer in Africa. They were no longer in the world they knew. The New World, for them, was a place of unimaginable cruelty, a land where their lives would be controlled by the whims of others, where they would be reduced to the status of property, where every ounce of their being would be exploited. When the ship docked, and the captives were taken ashore, the sight of the strange, unfamiliar land was both a relief and a curse. At least the endless sea was behind them, but ahead lay something even worse, a system that sought to erase everything they were. Cudjo and the other Africans were brought to the auction block, where their bodies were inspected, their value appraised, and their futures sold to the highest bidder. The experience of being bought and sold like livestock was dehumanizing, but it was also a stark reality for those caught in the web of the transatlantic slave trade. For Cudjo, this moment was the final severance from his past, the last piece of his identity stripped away. His name, his history, his family, all of it was gone. He was now just a commodity, an object to be bought, sold, and used for labor. The auction block was the ultimate symbol of his loss of self, of his heritage, of his humanity. His body, his life, his very essence was no longer his own. Yet, even in this moment of utter degradation, Cudjo's story was far from over. Though he was sold and forced to work on a plantation in Alabama, the boy who had once been taken from his homeland would not be easily erased. His journey would continue, and despite the horrors he had endured, he would find ways to resist, to hold on to the fragments of his past, and to survive in a land that sought to strip him of everything. The Middle Passage was only the beginning of Cudjo's trials, and though it marked the end of one life, it also marked the beginning of another, a life in which survival would be his most powerful form of resistance. Despite the brutality of the passage and the land that awaited him, Cudjo Lewis would become a witness to the horrors of slavery, and eventually, a voice for those who had no voice. His survival was not just a personal triumph, it was a testament to the strength of the human spirit, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, a light can still shine through. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition. Cudjo Lewis's arrival in the United States marked not just the end of his journey across the Atlantic, but the beginning of a new chapter in a life shaped by unimaginable hardship. After enduring the horrors of the Middle Passage, his arrival at the auction block was an experience that could only be described as the final act of dislocation, this time from his African heritage, from his identity, from his humanity. The brutality of the slave auction, with its dehumanizing rituals, stripped him not only of his name but of the very notion of self. His body was no longer his own. He was a commodity to be bought and sold, his fate decided by the highest bidder. Cudjo was sold to a plantation owner in Alabama, a man whose name, like the many others who would pass through his life, would fade into history. What mattered now was the life that awaited him, the unrelenting life of labor, deprivation, and humiliation. It was on this plantation that Cudjo would begin to experience the full scale of his dehumanization, but it was also here that he would develop the resilience and inner strength that would carry him through the darkest years of his existence. The very things that were meant to break him, forced labor, physical punishment, isolation, would become the forge in which his spirit would be hardened. In the harsh world of the plantation, Cudjo was confronted with the daily reality of slavery's cruelty. His days were long, his labor grueling, and his treatment brutal. His body became the tool for the plantation's productivity, and the same body that had once been free, that had once known the earth of Dahomey, now belonged to someone else. He worked from sunrise to sunset, often in the fields, harvesting cotton, tobacco, or whatever crop the plantation demanded. His hands, once accustomed to the tools and crafts of his people, were now calloused and bruised by the tools of American agriculture. Yet, despite the intense physical strain and the emotional toll, there was something inside Cudjo that refused to bend entirely. Perhaps it was his memory of Africa, or the deep spiritual connection he still felt to the land of his birth, but he never allowed himself to forget who he was. The mental and psychological toll of slavery was perhaps even more oppressive than the physical demands. For Cudjo, the hardest part of plantation life was not simply the backbreaking labor, it was the constant, inescapable feeling of being less than human. The constant reminders that he was considered property rather than a person, the casual cruelty of the overseers, the daily demeaning treatment, it all wore him down, yet never fully extinguished his inner resolve. He became part of a silent, invisible community on the plantation, the enslaved people who found ways to resist, if only in their hearts. The quiet act of preserving their dignity in a world designed to strip it away was a form of rebellion in itself. Despite the constant efforts to break his spirit, Cudjo found ways to hold on to his identity. He never allowed the name, Chad, the one forced upon him by his captors, to replace his true name, Cudjo. This was no small feat in a world where enslaved people were routinely stripped of their names, their heritage, their entire sense of self. Cudjo's insistence on retaining his African name was a quiet form of resistance, an act of defiance that ran deep. His name was not just a label, it was a symbol of everything that had been taken from him, and everything he still carried with him. The more his masters and overseers attempted to force their will upon him, the more he clung to this piece of his past. It was a reminder that, no matter the circumstances, he could still claim a part of himself, a part of his history that no one could take from him. But it wasn't just his name that Cudjo preserved, it was his culture, his language, his memories. Though many enslaved Africans were stripped of their cultural practices, forbidden to speak their native tongues, and forced to conform to the expectations of a white-dominated society, Cudjo found ways to resist this cultural erasure. He and his fellow slaves often gathered in secret to speak in their native language, to sing songs from their homeland, to tell the stories of their ancestors. These small acts of rebellion, though subtle, were powerful. They allowed Cudjo to retain a part of his identity, a part of his humanity that could not be erased by the brutal system of slavery. Yet, even as he resisted the cultural and emotional toll of slavery, Cudjo knew that his physical existence was at the mercy of his masters. The threat of violence was ever present, and any act of defiance, no matter how small, could be met with punishment. The overseers, brutal men who were tasked with controlling the enslaved population, were always looking for any excuse to beat or humiliate those under their charge. The punishments were swift and merciless, lashes from a whip, confinement in a small, dark cell, or even worse. For Cudjo, the fear of physical punishment was a constant presence, but so was the fear that, no matter how hard he worked or how much he suffered, he would always be seen as less than human. This constant fear and dehumanization wore heavily on the spirits of the enslaved, but Cudjo found small comforts in the relationships he formed with the other people on the plantation. They became his family, bound not by blood but by shared experience, by the mutual understanding of what it meant to live under the crushing weight of slavery. These relationships were a source of strength, as they offered moments of respite from the brutality of their daily lives. In the stillness of the night, they would share stories, sing songs, and hold on to whatever piece of their culture they could. Yet, despite all the oppression, Cudjo found a flicker of hope in the years that followed, the coming of the Civil War and the eventual promise of emancipation. Though the war was a devastating time for the nation, it was also a time of profound change. As the Union armies marched south, the Confederacy crumbled, and the institution of slavery began to collapse. For Cudjo and his fellow slaves, the possibility of freedom became something tangible, something they could almost taste. The Emancipation Proclamation, signed by President Abraham Lincoln in 1863, was the catalyst that set in motion the end of slavery. The proclamation was a glimmer of light in an otherwise dark world, and it filled Cudjo with a sense of hope he had not known for years. For the first time since his capture, he began to believe that his life, and the lives of his fellow slaves, might one day be their own again. But the reality of freedom was not as simple as it seemed. Though the formal end of slavery was proclaimed, the lived experience of freedom was much more complicated. The South, and Alabama in particular, was a place where the legacy of slavery lingered, where the scars of the past would take generations to heal. Cudjo, like so many other former slaves, found himself in a world that had no place for him. The structures of power that had once enslaved him were now gone, but they were replaced by new forms of oppression, new struggles, and new barriers. Cudjo, a man who had survived the horrors of the Middle Passage, the brutality of slavery, and the violence of the auction block, now found himself in a strange and unfamiliar world. He was no longer a slave, but he was still trapped in a system that sought to keep him subjugated. Despite the promise of freedom, he was still a man without land, without resources, without protection. The world he once knew was gone, replaced by a world that was just as harsh, just as unforgiving. However, even in this harsh new world, Cudjo found a way to survive. His determination to preserve his identity, his connection to his homeland, and his sense of self remained unbroken. It was in this new chapter of his life that he would begin to rebuild, piece by piece, what had been lost. He would go on to be a founder of Africatown, a community in Alabama established by freed slaves, and he would continue to carry the memory of his past with him, even as he looked toward a future shaped by his survival, resilience, and enduring strength. Through all of his trials, through the unimaginable suffering, the years of labor, the brutality, and the isolation, Cudjo Lewis remained a man connected to his roots, a man who refused to let slavery define him. His story, marked by a quiet yet unyielding resistance, would go on to become a powerful testament to the resilience of the human spirit, and a reminder of the dark legacy of slavery that shaped the lives of millions. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition when the war finally ended, and the Emancipation Proclamation was no longer just a distant hope but a real promise. Cudjo Lewis's life did not magically transform into the freedom he had longed for during the years of brutality on the plantation. The world around him was still marked by the deep scars left by slavery, and even the official end of slavery could not wipe away the long-lasting psychological and social damage that had been inflicted on both the enslaved and the society that had enslaved them. The promise of freedom, while monumental, was not simple, and the immediate aftermath was filled with complexities, uncertainties, and challenges that would test the very essence of Cudjo's being. For Cudjo, freedom meant the end of his bondage and the chains that had bound him physically for so long. But freedom also meant the loss of a structure that had been his whole life. On the plantation, despite the cruelty and oppression, there had been some sort of order, a rigid hierarchy, a set of expectations, and even a small degree of human connection. In the years after emancipation, Cudjo, like many newly freed individuals, had to navigate a world that had just begun to rebuild itself but was still deeply entrenched in the old systems of racism, violence, and inequality. He was no longer legally a slave, but in many ways, the social structures that had supported slavery were still in place, and the stigma of being black in the South was as powerful as ever. It was in this new and turbulent world that Cudjo found himself struggling to create meaning and build a life. He was no longer just a man working the fields for a master's gain, he was a man who had been forced to adapt, forced to survive, and forced to contend with the deep racial divides that were so ingrained in the fabric of American society. He had lost so much over the course of his life, his homeland, his family, his cultural identity, but now, in this newly emancipated state, he had to figure out how to reclaim something of himself in a world that had once tried to erase him completely. Despite the bitterness and confusion of these early years of freedom, Cudjo found that some part of him remained unbroken. He was a survivor, a man who had lived through the unimaginable horrors of the Middle Passage, the brutal violence of slavery, and the constant threat of death. He knew, deep down, that the trauma he had endured had only made him stronger. And yet, it was the emotional and psychological weight of his past that would follow him for the rest of his life, casting a shadow over his every step. In the years that followed the Civil War, Cudjo, like many freedmen, sought to carve out a space for himself in a society that still viewed him as less than human. He was no longer bound by chains, but the chains of racial prejudice, economic hardship, and social exclusion were as real as ever. For Cudjo, the South had not changed as drastically as many had hoped. The end of slavery was supposed to mark the beginning of a new chapter in American history, one in which all men, regardless of color, would have the chance to be free and equal. But in reality, the freedoms promised by the Emancipation Proclamation were often hindered by the same forces that had supported slavery, racist attitudes, white supremacy, and a broken social order that did not know how to integrate the formerly enslaved into the broader fabric of American life. Cudjo, ever the survivor, was not content to accept the reality that was handed to him. Though the economic opportunities for black people in the South were severely limited, Cudjo managed to find a way to support himself and begin building something of his own. His efforts, however, were not without significant challenges. Even in the early days of his freedom, he found that many of the landowners in the South were reluctant to provide opportunities for black people, forcing many former slaves into sharecropping or other forms of low-wage labor that kept them in a state of dependency and subjugation. The promise of land and independence that had been promised to many former slaves by the federal government through the 40 acres and a mule policy was never fully realized, leaving many black families without the means to build their own futures. Yet, despite these limitations, Cudjo never lost sight of his goal to rebuild a community of his own. His sense of self, though deeply shaped by his experiences as an enslaved person, was also anchored in his belief in the possibility of a better future. He understood that freedom was not just the absence of chains, it was the ability to shape one's own life, to control one's own destiny. In his quest for independence, Cudjo eventually became one of the founders of Africatown, a small community established by former slaves in the aftermath of the Civil War. Africatown became a symbol of what could be achieved, even in the face of adversity. It was a place where people like Cudjo could live out their dreams of freedom, a place where they could rebuild the pieces of their heritage that had been lost during the years of enslavement. Africatown was not just a physical settlement, it represented the resilience of Cudjo and his fellow freedmen. It was a space where they could reconnect with their African roots, rebuild their lives, and pass on their cultural traditions to future generations. For Cudjo, it was a way to create a legacy that could endure long after the trauma of his past had faded from living memory. By establishing Africatown, he was not just constructing a physical space, he was also making a statement, that, despite everything that had been taken from him, he still had the power to create something of lasting value. But even as he worked to build Africatown and establish his life in the aftermath of slavery, Cudjo could not escape the larger forces at work in the country. The legacy of slavery, though legally abolished, continued to shape every aspect of life in the South. Racial prejudice was deeply entrenched, and black people were still seen as inferior by many of their white counterparts. The economic and social systems that had upheld slavery were not easily dismantled, and the challenges of creating a fully integrated society were as complicated as ever. The Reconstruction era, while a time of great change and potential, also saw a backlash against the rights of newly freed black Americans. The rise of Jim Crow laws, segregation, and racial violence made it clear that freedom, though legally granted, was far from realized for many black Americans. Still, Cudjo's determination to live a life of dignity and self-respect never wavered. Even as the challenges of life in the South threatened to overwhelm him, he remained steadfast in his commitment to preserving his identity and his heritage. He never forgot the lessons of his past, the pain of being torn from his homeland, the suffering of being reduced to property, and the constant fight for survival that had defined his existence for so many years. But he also never forgot the strength it had taken to survive, and the deep-rooted sense of purpose that had carried him through the darkest moments of his life. Cudjo's journey, from the horrors of the slave ship to the establishment of Africatown, was a testament not only to his strength but to the strength of the African American community as a whole. His story, while deeply personal, became a symbol of the larger struggle for freedom and justice in the United States. Even as he navigated the complexities of life in post-emancipation America, Cudjo remained a living link to the past, a connection to a time of suffering and survival that could never be forgotten. His legacy, carried forward in Africatown and in the memories of those who knew him, would serve as a reminder of both the horrors of slavery and the enduring resilience of the human spirit. Cudjo Lewis was not just a man who survived slavery, he was a man who carried the weight of his past with him, not as a burden, but as a testament to the strength that freedom, though hard-won, could never take away. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition. As Cudjo Lewis entered the phase of life that followed his emancipation, the weight of his past hung heavily on his every decision, interaction, and effort to rebuild his life. His journey from the horrors of the Middle Passage to the brutal life of a slave on a southern plantation had not only physically scarred him but had also deeply imprinted upon his psyche a sense of loss, of being torn from everything that was once familiar, safe, and meaningful. While the chains of slavery had been broken, the social, emotional, and psychological effects of being an enslaved person were far from dissipating. Even though freedom had been formally granted through the abolition of slavery, for Cudjo, and for so many other freedmen, the landscape of their lives remained fraught with systemic challenges that made the notion of true freedom a distant ideal rather than an immediate reality. When he finally became free, Cudjo found himself faced with a harsh new world where the formal end of slavery did not necessarily mean the end of racial prejudice, economic exploitation, or social inequality. In fact, the post-emancipation world presented new forms of oppression, ones that were subtler, perhaps, but still profoundly limiting. Black Americans were still considered second-class citizens, denied the full rights and privileges of citizenship that their white counterparts enjoyed. Despite the promises of the Union victory and the legal freedom granted by the 13th Amendment, Cudjo and other former slaves found themselves navigating an environment that was still determined to maintain white supremacy, a world where every aspect of life, education, employment, civil rights, was influenced by an overarching racial hierarchy that kept Black Americans marginalized and disenfranchised. For Cudjo, the deep systemic racism that existed even after slavery was abolished was a bitter pill to swallow. Though he was no longer bound by the chains that had once confined his body, he was still bound by the social structures that oppressed him and his people. He was now a free man, but in many ways, the fight for his own humanity, his dignity, and his future was just beginning. The legal abolition of slavery did not instantly erase the deeply entrenched belief systems that viewed Black people as less than human. Though freedom had been granted in name, it had not yet been realized in practice. Cudjo had spent decades living under the thumb of white slaveholders who treated him as little more than property. Now, even as a free man, he continued to face discrimination, prejudice, and oppression. While some of the southern plantations were slowly shifting their operations to accommodate the new reality, many others simply used new systems like sharecropping to keep formerly enslaved people in a position of economic dependence. Sharecropping, which required Black farmers to work on land owned by whites in exchange for a portion of the crop, was nothing more than a new form of bondage. It kept freedmen in a perpetual cycle of poverty, limiting their opportunities for true independence or upward mobility. The harsh realities of life in the post-slavery South were compounded by the cultural and emotional scars that Cudjo carried with him. Having spent his youth in Africa, where he was part of a tight-knit community with a rich cultural heritage, he had witnessed firsthand the destruction of that way of life. The loss of his family, his home, and his culture were wounds that never truly healed. Though he had found strength in his identity as a former enslaved person, it was difficult for him to reconcile that part of his life with the hope for a future of true freedom. His quest for personal dignity and independence was not just a physical one, it was an emotional and psychological journey as well. During these formative years of freedom, Cudjo also began to grapple with the larger question of memory and legacy. What did it mean to be free in a society that continued to perpetuate racial inequality? How could he rebuild what had been lost, not just in terms of material possessions, but in terms of his cultural heritage. The question of how to preserve the history of his people, and the collective memories of slavery, was one that weighed heavily on him. The loss of his homeland, of his family, and of his identity during the years of enslavement had created a deep well of grief within him. But the desire to preserve the history of those experiences, to ensure that the stories of his people were not erased from history, was equally powerful. For Cudjo, this desire to remember and to pass down the stories of slavery to future generations became a driving force in his life. Even though he was free, and even though he was now trying to rebuild his own existence in the world, he could never fully sever the connection between his past and his future. The legacy of slavery and the ongoing struggle for Black Americans to claim their place in a country that had denied them their humanity was something that could not be overlooked, even in the pursuit of his own survival. It was in the context of this deeply emotional and historical understanding that Cudjo began to take on the role of a community elder and a historian. The memories of his youth in Africa, his capture, the journey across the Atlantic, and his life in slavery were pieces of a larger story, one that connected him to the millions of other Africans who had suffered under the institution of slavery. His personal history was no longer just his own, it became part of a larger narrative, one that needed to be shared, remembered, and honored. Cudjo's efforts to preserve the stories of his people did not go unnoticed. His voice became increasingly important in the local community. As a man who had lived through the horrors of slavery and had come out the other side, he was seen as a living testament to the resilience and strength of the Black community. His story, while deeply personal, was also a collective one, and his decision to speak out about his experiences became an important act of resistance. In the years following emancipation, Cudjo began to share his story with those who would listen. His oral history, passed down to others, would eventually become a vital part of the record of slavery in America. While many enslaved people were denied the opportunity to speak about their experiences, Cudjo's willingness to share his narrative made him one of the few who could offer a first-hand account of the brutal realities of slavery. His voice became an important tool in the fight for justice and equality, a reminder that the struggles of the past must not be forgotten. But despite his newfound role as a storyteller and a community leader, Cudjo still faced many challenges. The legal end of slavery did not magically make the South a racially equal society. The rise of white supremacist organizations, such as the Ku Klux Klan, further complicated the social landscape for African Americans, especially those like Cudjo who were seeking to rebuild their lives. Racial violence, intimidation, and economic exploitation remained powerful forces in the post-Civil War South, and many Black Americans found themselves battling not just for physical freedom but for social and political equality as well. In these difficult years, Cudjo found solace in the community he helped to build. Africatown, the small town established by freed slaves like himself, became a symbol of resilience and defiance. Though the town was small, it was a place where Cudjo and other former slaves could find the freedom to live and to work on their own terms. It was a place where the bonds of community and shared history could be honored and preserved, a place where Cudjo and his fellow residents could resist the attempts to erase their history and their identity. While Africatown provided a sense of belonging and purpose for Cudjo and his family, the struggle for full freedom was far from over. His life, marked by the violence of slavery, the pain of loss, and the quest for dignity, would continue to be shaped by the ongoing struggle for justice. Cudjo's story, however, would ultimately outlive him. His decision to preserve his own personal history, his decision to share the truth of his experiences, became a legacy that would live on long after his death. Through his story, Cudjo ensured that the horrors of slavery would not be forgotten and that the strength of those who endured it would never be erased. His testimony was not just about the past, it was a call to future generations to continue the fight for freedom, equality, and justice. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition. As Cudjo Lewis navigated the early years of freedom in the post-slavery South, he realized that true liberty was far more complex than the mere absence of chains. Emancipation was supposed to mark the beginning of a new era for Black Americans, a moment when they could step forward into the full promise of citizenship. But the truth was far grimmer. Though slavery had been abolished, the systemic structures of oppression, both social and economic, remained intact. The very essence of freedom, as Cudjo came to understand, was not just about legal status but about gaining control over his own life and destiny in a world still shaped by the remnants of slavery. The land of his birth, Africa, was an indelible part of Cudjo's identity, and in many ways, it remained a distant but constant presence in his life. Yet, the gap between the world he had known and the one that surrounded him was so vast, so impossibly different, that it often seemed like an insurmountable chasm. His memories of his homeland were blurred by the traumatic experiences he had endured, the Middle Passage, the auction block, the years spent as a laboring slave. What remained was a faint but powerful sense of connection, a longing for the life that had been taken from him. Africa Town, the community Cudjo helped to establish after the war, was his attempt to reclaim some semblance of the life that had been stolen. It was here that Cudjo sought solace, not just from the oppressive realities of the larger world, but from the ghosts of his past. The people of Africa Town, many of whom had been captured and brought to America just like him, shared a unique bond. They were survivors of the same brutal system, and they understood, perhaps better than anyone else, the complexities of rebuilding a life after the unthinkable. For Cudjo and others who settled in Africa Town, their journey toward freedom was not just about physical liberty but about cultural and emotional reclamation. They were no longer bound by chains, but they were still tethered to the memories of their lost world. The people of Africa Town began to form a tight-knit community, where traditions and stories could be shared, where children could be raised with a sense of their African heritage, and where the anguish of their collective past could find a voice. But this reclamation of culture was not without its struggles. The shadow of the world they had left behind loomed large, and the reality of post-war Southern racism continued to undermine their efforts. While Cudjo found peace in Africa Town, the broader racial landscape remained deeply oppressive. The economic structures that had kept him and others like him in servitude for so long were slow to change. Sharecropping, which became a widespread system in the South after the Civil War, was a brutal reminder that economic freedom had not truly been attained. Former slaves were often forced into contracts with white landowners that kept them in perpetual debt, unable to escape from the cycle of poverty and dependence. Even though Cudjo was no longer a slave, he was still bound to a system that ensured his labor was exploited, and his opportunities for true independence were severely limited. Racial violence continued to be a constant threat. The rise of organizations like the Ku Klux Klan instilled fear in the hearts of freed black people across the South. Cudjo, like many of his peers, faced the ongoing struggle to protect himself, his family, and his community from the ever-present threat of violence. Though Africa Town offered some sanctuary, it was never fully immune from the racial animus that still gripped the region. White supremacy, having been formally upheld through slavery, did not simply vanish with its legal abolition. Instead, it mutated into new forms of social, political, and economic control, forms that sought to keep black Americans subjugated even in the face of their newfound freedom. Despite these challenges, Cudjo's resolve remained unshaken. He continued to fight, not just for the survival of his community, but for the preservation of his history. The stories of the African captives, of their suffering during the Middle Passage, of the brutal realities of slavery, were not just a part of the past, they were a part of the ongoing struggle for dignity and justice. For Cudjo, sharing these stories was an act of defiance against the forces that sought to erase them. These were not just stories of pain and hardship, they were stories of survival, resilience, and strength. Cudjo's personal narrative became a form of resistance. His ability to speak about his experiences, of his capture, his journey across the Atlantic, and his life as a slave, was a way to reclaim the power that had been stripped from him. His voice, which had once been silenced by the brutality of the slave system, now became a tool for historical preservation. By sharing his story, he ensured that future generations would understand not only the horrors of slavery but also the depth of the strength and courage that allowed people like him to survive it. But as time passed, Cudjo began to understand that the fight for freedom was not simply about personal survival or rebuilding a community, it was about challenging the very systems that had upheld slavery for so long. In many ways, the real struggle was not just about achieving physical freedom, but about confronting the deeply ingrained racial prejudices that continued to define American society. Despite his freedom, Cudjo was still regarded as less than fully human by many in the country. The scars of slavery were not just personal, they were societal, woven into the fabric of the nation itself. Cudjo's life, then, became a paradox. On one hand, he was a man who had survived one of the most brutal and dehumanizing systems the world had ever seen. On the other hand, he was a man who lived in a society that still saw him as inferior. His efforts to rebuild Africatown were both an expression of his determination to move forward and a statement of the ongoing struggle for true freedom. His desire to preserve the African heritage that had been stolen from him was an effort to reclaim the past, even as he struggled to navigate the realities of the present. In his later years, as the post-war South began to consolidate into a new system of segregation, Cudjo found himself faced with the realization that true freedom would be a lifelong struggle. The nation had been forever altered by the Civil War and the abolition of slavery, but it was still a long way from being a just and equitable society. The challenges that Black Americans faced in the decades following the war, economic exploitation, racial violence, political disenfranchisement, were not easily overcome. Yet Cudjo's journey did not end in despair. While he lived through some of the darkest years of American history, he also lived through the hope and possibility that came with the Reconstruction era. His ability to survive and to help establish Africatown was a testament to his resilience and his commitment to building a better future. He had lived through the horrors of slavery, but he also lived to see a new world emerge from the ashes. His story was not just one of pain and suffering, it was also a story of perseverance, of fighting for something better, and of never giving up on the hope for a brighter future. As time passed, Cudjo's role in the larger historical narrative became more clear. He was no longer just a survivor of slavery, he was a living embodiment of the endurance of the human spirit. His legacy, carried forward in Africatown, would serve as a reminder of the strength and resilience of those who had endured the horrors of slavery and the subsequent challenges of freedom. Through his survival, and through his determination to preserve his story, Cudjo ensured that the history of slavery would never be forgotten and that the sacrifices of those who fought for freedom would never be erased. By the time of his death, Cudjo had become more than just a man, he had become a symbol of survival, of resistance, and of the ongoing struggle for justice. His story was a beacon of hope for future generations, a reminder that no matter how dark the world might seem, there would always be those who, like Cudjo, would find a way to survive, to thrive, and to leave a lasting mark on history. Born enslaved, died free, how Cudjo Lewis carried slavery's truth beyond abolition. As Cudjo Lewis continued to navigate the years of freedom after emancipation, the complex legacy of slavery shadowed every part of his existence. His life was a profound study in resilience, survival, and a relentless quest for meaning in a world that still harbored the deep scars of the past. The horrors of his youth, the disorienting and brutal experience of being sold into slavery, the anguish of the Middle Passage, all of it had shaped him into a man of immense strength and quiet resolve. But it also left him with a profound sense of loss that would follow him throughout his life. Freedom, when it came, was not a balm for that loss. Instead, it was the beginning of a long, difficult journey to reconcile the man he had become with the life he had once known, and to figure out how to carry the weight of history, not only for himself but for future generations. Cudjo's story was not just about survival, it was about a desire for justice, a desire to make sure that the lives of those who had been enslaved were not forgotten. This urgency to preserve the truth of slavery's horrors and its lingering effects became the driving force of his later years. He understood that the past, though painful, had to be shared. His voice, once silenced by the brutal system of slavery, would become one of the few surviving records of the African experience in America during this pivotal time in history. His willingness to share his personal story, often against the grain of the silence surrounding slavery, was not merely an act of catharsis for him. It was a duty, an imperative, to ensure that the collective memory of his people would endure. But even as Cudjo's role as a witness to history became increasingly important, his own battle for freedom and dignity did not end with his emancipation. The years following the Civil War, though officially heralding the end of slavery, ushered in a new, deeply entrenched system of segregation and racial prejudice. The remnants of slavery were not just cultural, they were built into the very fabric of society. While the legal shackles had been removed, many black Americans, including Cudjo, still found themselves living in a society where racism and discrimination were woven into the very structures of government, economics, and daily life. The system of sharecropping, for example, may have replaced slavery, but it kept freedmen trapped in cycles of debt and poverty. Black men and women who had once been considered property were now, in many ways, economically subjugated, still bound to the land, still under the control of white landowners. The slow unraveling of the promises made during Reconstruction showed that legal freedom was insufficient when a society was still invested in maintaining racial hierarchies. Despite being legally free, Cudjo and others like him faced the new threat of disenfranchisement. Black citizens were systematically denied voting rights through poll taxes, literacy tests, and the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan. In the face of these institutionalized obstacles, many freedmen were relegated to a status no better than before, economically dependent, politically marginalized, and socially oppressed. The emotional toll of realizing that true equality was not forthcoming could have easily led to despair. Yet, Cudjo's character remained unwavering. What was perhaps most striking about Cudjo's journey was his unrelenting commitment to his community. His efforts to establish Africatown were more than just a physical act of land settlement, they were a manifestation of his desire to create something that could survive beyond him, something that would carry his legacy and the history of the people who had been brought to this country through violence and cruelty. Africatown, like so many other communities founded by former slaves, became a symbol of hope, a place where black people could reclaim some measure of autonomy and self-determination. It was a place where Cudjo, in a sense, could begin to rebuild what had been destroyed during his time as a slave. The creation of Africatown was not just an effort to physically rebuild, it was an attempt to recapture the cultural, spiritual, and emotional essence of the African identity that had been ripped away from him and his fellow slaves. Though the scars of their forced migration and violent history would never disappear, the people of Africatown worked hard to maintain the practices and traditions that connected them to their homeland. Their attempts to preserve the African language, customs, and spirituality were acts of resistance, moments where they asserted that even in a world that sought to strip them of their identity, they could still hold on to something sacred and meaningful. Yet, even as the residents of Africatown fought to maintain their cultural heritage, they faced a relentless battle against the forces of racism and inequality. Despite the fact that they were free, the world beyond Africatown did not offer much in the way of opportunity or respect. The fight for equality was ongoing, and every step toward progress seemed to be met with another form of resistance, whether through the entrenched racism of white landowners or the violence perpetuated by hate groups. Cudjo, despite his best efforts, could not escape the harsh realities of the world outside his small community. While Africatown provided a degree of protection, it was never free from the threat of violence, marginalization, and economic hardship. As the years passed, the ongoing battle for black rights seemed to be taking its toll on Cudjo. His life, which had once been defined by the cruel conditions of slavery, was now defined by a fight against a society that refused to fully recognize his humanity. His work in Africatown, though fulfilling in many ways, could not shield him from the overwhelming forces of systemic racism and economic exploitation. The world outside was still dominated by white supremacy, and no matter how hard he fought, he could not break the chains that still held his people in a state of oppression. It was in these years of hardship and struggle that Cudjo, along with others in Africatown, began to realize the depths of the challenge they faced. The world that they had hoped to build, one in which they could live free from the terror of slavery and in full dignity, was still a distant dream. The same systems that had supported slavery were now keeping them in subjugation, ensuring that they would never be able to fully escape the oppression that had shaped their lives for so long. In the face of these difficulties, Cudjo's efforts to preserve his own story and the stories of his people became even more crucial. He knew that in order for the legacy of slavery to be remembered, it was essential for future generations to hear the truth. Though the world around him remained hostile, Cudjo understood that history, and the truth of that history, had the power to endure. He knew that the stories of those who had suffered under slavery had to be told, or else they would be lost to time, buried beneath the weight of a society that sought to forget its past. Cudjo's decision to share his life story with others, to open up about the horrors he had experienced, was both an act of personal healing and a broader effort to ensure that the realities of slavery were not erased. He knew that history was not just about the events of the past, it was about the people who lived through them and the legacies they left behind. By sharing his story, Cudjo ensured that the voices of those who had been enslaved would never be silenced, and that the truth of their lives, painful and difficult as it was, would continue to be heard. The work of preserving these memories became an essential part of Cudjo's life, even as he struggled with the many obstacles that remained in his path. His experiences, his survival, and his efforts to create a life of dignity in the face of impossible odds became a living testament to the power of resilience and the unyielding human spirit. Cudjo's life story, which had been forged in the fires of slavery, would go on to inspire countless others, offering a powerful reminder that even in the face of overwhelming darkness, the will to survive, to remember, and to seek justice would always endure. Through his efforts, he ensured that the legacy of slavery, and the strength of those who had fought against it, would never be forgotten.